Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Great to have you all with us here today. We've got an important discussion that's going to take place. We're going to talk about how to empower your employees to be emergency responders should the need arise. To address this topic, we have with us Patrick Hardy, Chief Executive Officer of Hytropy Disaster Management, and he is soon to be has a soon to be coming out book. I think it's in March, Patrick, called Design by Disaster: The Revolutionary Blueprint to Master Your Next Crisis or Emergency. Welcome, Patrick. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your company. What is it that you do?
Well, what I do is I am a comprehensive solution towards working with businesses to give them a comprehensive disaster program. So we write disaster plans, we train staff, we run drills, we talk about their equipment, we make sure that they have everything they need for any kind of disaster or emergency.
Now, responding to disasters, it's a very important activity that employees probably get a little confused about, right? I mean, they're always told, don't be involved, but now we want you involved. So I'm sure there's some anxiety that comes with employees trying to figure out what they should do and where they should be stepping in. What do you find that to be the situation? Do you find employees are oftentimes confused as to what they should be doing and if they should be stepping in to do things that perhaps has always been traditionally done by management?
Absolutely. It is a paralysis that is really commonly known as the bystander syndrome or the bystander effect. And one of the things that I've discovered is that when we talk about the bystander effect, it's usually a situation where you are driving along in your car or you're walking along the street and all of a sudden you see an accident and you decide you're not going to get involved and you decide you're not going to call 911. You're not going to get involved in the situation because you're worried about it or you don't know what to do. And more importantly, you think to yourself that it's okay if I don't do anything, because if I don't do anything, there's plenty of other people and they will handle it on my behalf. And that's what happens with businesses all the time of many different types. And I work with bars and restaurants and farms, and I even work with an alligator farm in Florida. I mean, all kinds of businesses. And no matter what the industry, I find that when you don't empower employees, you don't give them the authority, you don't give them the training, and you don't put them in a position to be successful in an emergency, then guess what? They don't want to do anything. And then all of a sudden you have a large group of people, valuable folks who could be great emergency responders who instead stand around like bystanders.
Now, you have a three-step plan on how a business should go about getting employees beyond being just bystanders when there's an emergency situation. Let's start with the rewriting of disaster plans. What's important to know when it comes to how a business approaches its disaster plan?
A disaster plan has to be empowering for employees. And what do I mean by that? Exactly what you were talking about earlier, which is the vast majority of the disaster plans that I run across, they all say things like, don't worry about it, just hand it off to management, let them do it. But then the plan misses something. What happens if management isn't available? What happens if they aren't able to get to the site in time? What happens if they are injured? This, in fact, happens all the time where you'll have an emergency, especially one that is spontaneous, and you'll have a number of injured folks. And then you have employees who are not only paralyzed, they are standing there in a dangerous situation. And the first thing they're going to do is they're going to leave. So you're absolutely right. What a plan has to do is it has to put people in a position to say there is a set procedures and policies that I know that I can execute immediately when a disaster strikes, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's what we call a technological disaster. So like things like a utility outage or a chemical spill or a transportation accident, like a plane crash. Those have happened many times, or security emergencies. Things like acts of terrorism or what we hear about in the news all the time, mass shootings. So anything along those lines, we have to have some kind of policy framework in place that gives employees something to do. So we can't simply tell them, yep, you're empowered to act in an emergency. We actually have to give them set policies and procedures that they have the confidence to be able to perform effectively when there's a lot of chaos going on around them.
Are they willing to do that? Are employees like, yes, I know what to do and I want to do this and I want to be involved? Or is there a lot of hesitancy on their part? What do you find?
I find they're tremendously hesitant when there's no framework in place. If you don't have the framework in place, and the 3-point process that I created is what I call the C3 method, which is, and I'm going to sort of talk about that, which is when these 3 steps are put into place, even when a written disaster plan is absent, I find that employees are immeasurably better and they're willing to respond a whole lot more, because I can think of a dozen industries, including this one, where employees will probably never touch a disaster plan in their entire life. And that's okay. That's actually okay. Because if we are able to empower them with what I call the C3 method, they will be able to act a lot more confidently. So the 3 planks are taking command. That's really the first one and the most important one, because what I mean by taking command is they're given an ability to lead. They're able to lead themselves, are able to lead the people around them. They're able to work with management. They're able to work with those around them, because managers are always outnumbered. And in an emergency, that proportion could be even larger. The second plank after someone takes leadership is communicating. And communication is so important in an emergency. In fact, when I worked for the governor's office of Homeland Security in Louisiana, I would read these long reports after we would have a massive hurricane, and they would talk about all the things that we did well and the things we have to work on. And inevitably, the number one element that we had to work on every single time was communication. And when I talk about communication, and I discuss this in the book completely, is not only just telling people what to do, not barking orders like you see on TV, it's creating a team framework. And what I have to tell managers sometimes is I have to say, if you're not available, the employees need to be able to communicate and create a team among themselves. And if you are able to give people that, then if there isn't a disaster plan, in some ways that's still okay, because there's still a plank of efficiency where they can act on their own, and they can work together within some of the things you've trained them on the equipment that's been made available, etc. And then the last plank is easy. The last one is what I call carrying out. And carrying out is simply that, getting it done and ensuring that tasks are effectively completed, that ensuring that we're working as a team, that because the dynamics will change based on the kinds of disasters we are facing, each one of those things are going to be really important. So taking command, communicating, and then carrying out. Those are the 3 elements that are going to make the major difference.
So, what should a business realize about the EST of its property preparedness program? For our viewers, EST being equipment, supplies, and technology.
One of the things I find about EST is that people buy what I like to call the wonder weapons of disaster preparedness. We all know what I'm talking about here. We're talking about those red backpacks you buy at the big box stores, or that piece of equipment that you heard about on the internet, or you saw it on YouTube, you saw that ad and said, that's an indestructible flashlight, or that knife will cut through the bumper of a car and then it will also cut through a tomato at the same time. And I turn to them and I'm always suspicious about those, because even if they're true, let's pretend that it does everything it says it does, which is great, and I'm happy about that. You should not surrender your disaster program to a piece of equipment. And when I talked about the C3 method a minute ago, I find that people literally become bystanders in their own disaster program, because instead of surrendering their authority and empowerment to a manager, as we would see in a really poorly written disaster plan, they also hand it off now to a piece of equipment. So they turn to the equipment and say, piece of equipment, indestructible flashlight, indestructible radio, handle my disaster program for me. I don't need to train. We don't need to drill. It's perfectly fine. We've got this piece of equipment. It'll handle everything for us, with the biggest offender being generators. I hear about this all the time in your industry, where people ask me about generators. And I say a generator is great, as long as you understand one thing. You shouldn't place everything in the entire success of your disaster response on a generator, on a piece of equipment. Because if you do that, then if something happens to that equipment, you have then surrendered the entire effectiveness of your disaster response to a machine.
How important is it that your disaster EST sync up with your overall disaster plan?
Critical. One of the things that I say to people is I say, whenever you buy a piece of equipment, if you have a disaster plan in place, then you should look at your disaster plan and say, what does my disaster plan want me to do? I was at a school once, and this was a school in a very affluent area of California, and they had chemical showers, and they had a suture kit, and they had a big pod filled with all kinds of bedding supplies and everything. And so I would look at their disaster plan, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. These guys could put up like a field hospital. And I looked at their disaster plan, and the disaster plan said, we're going to get all the kids off the campus within 5 hours of an emergency. And so there's an obvious lack of synergy there, because you're not going to need chemical toilets and showers and all these other things and major suture kits if you're not prepared for it. And in addition to that, I turned to the teachers and I said, I want you guys to raise your hand. Tell me anybody in here who knows how to suture a wound. And not a single person knew how to do it. And so I say, when you buy a piece of equipment, I think that that's great. I love equipment. I have it in my own home. But whenever you're going to do it, the link to the disaster plan is so critical that what you are asking people to do in the disaster plan needs to line up with the equipment that you are providing them with. So if you are requesting your employees do search and rescue, that's fine. But then make sure that you have the equipment for them to do it. Or if you're not going to do search and rescue, don't put search and rescue equipment in there, because you know what employees will do? They will pick it up and they will do things that they probably shouldn't do, and puts them in an unsafe situation, not only for themselves, but for other responders and for the victims that they're trying to rescue.
Has a lot of the advice that you put forward, has it changed or been altered at all by all the mass shootings and things that we've seen out there? It's kind of taken a little different twist perhaps for businesses who, have to deal with that.
It has. One of the things that happened in the Uvalde shooting in Texas is one of the things that we are discovering right now, and the official reports aren't out yet, so everything I'm saying is very informal. We don't yet know the complete story, but it seems as though one of the biggest issues in Uvalde was, who is going to take command here? Who's going to lead? And there seems to be this tug of war between people who are in first response capabilities, so law enforcement officers and tactical officers, and then parents and others. And it is that struggle that I am seeing with businesses all over. And one of the things that we are reemphasizing, and one of the things I put in the book, and I mentioned the Uvalde shooting in there, was I actually say, one of the things is that when no one takes command, when no one leads, when everybody says, it's okay, I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to hand it off to law enforcement officers, or I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to hand it off to someone else, then what happens is that you turn everyone into a bystander. You instantly turned everyone into a bystander. Now, if there's situations where you don't want employees involved in something because it's either too dangerous, that's perfectly fine. But what you have to do is you have to explain to them what you're going to do if they're not going to be involved. So what do you want them to do instead? When you give people nothing, it turns people into bystanders. That turns into frustration, which turns into anger, which turns into people doing actions that are tremendously unsafe. In other businesses, particularly in ones where you have large numbers of employees and few managers, as a result of mass shootings, there has been a greater conversation about examining what happens when employees are terminated. How do we handle that in a compassionate way? How do we make sure that we are taking care of our employees? Because for the most part, if you exclude schools, the vast majority of the people who commit shootings on the job in the workplace are employees or ex-employees. So there is now greater support for mental health and what we call employee action programs. So actually and employee assistance programs where people are actually being engaged by management before these things occur.
And simple things too, like don't let ex-employees into the building, right? If there's just even if you're their friend, just don't let them in. There's a policy in place. So we've talked about disaster plans being rewritten. We've talked about disaster ESTs being better aligned. we have to talk about training and drills for employees. What's the best approach to that? Is there a right and a wrong way to go about getting employees set up to respond to be most effective?
When I was an EMT instructor, I taught them on weapons of mass destruction, on mass casualty incidents, on hazardous material spills. And I remember the very first year I did it, it was filled with 18-year-old kids, fresh out of high school. They want to be EMTs. They want to work on the ambulance. They're so excited. And they've been working and they've trained on strokes and on heart attacks and on bleeding and on all the things you have to learn. And my sections were always at the end, right? Because it involves a lot of different elements. So the very first year, I had them take out the books and I was talking to them just like I was talking to you and walking them through the response. And I was just getting these glares of people who just wondered what in the world I was talking about. And so what I did was I said to them, everybody, I want you to close the books, close them entirely. And they closed them and I said, pull out that mannequin over there. And they pulled one out. I said, pull that mannequin over there and that one and that one. And we pulled them all out. And I said, okay, guys, instead of me walking you through this in the book, we're going to physically do this. So actually employing kinesthetic learning. And especially in the feed industry where you have people who are in the industry working with their hands every single day, videos don't work, talking to people casually doesn't work. You need to give them tactical things to do. And by tactical, I mean touching, feeling, doing, training by doing, drilling by doing. And those are the things that tend to work very well. During the BP oil spill, I was trying to train oyster fishermen on how to respond to a hurricane because we had boats that were going out to the Gulf of Mexico. This is in June, July, August, September, so a time when there tends to be a lot of hurricanes. And I sat there in front of everybody and I was trying to explain to them, okay, guys, move your boats over here, and then you're going to do this and that. And people weren't listening at all. And so I said, okay, you know what we're going to do tomorrow morning? I'm going to have everybody get in your boats and we're going to simulate an evacuation. So everybody get here at 6 and then we're going to actually do it. And they did it. We launched everybody. And I said, okay, we have 40 minutes, get everybody back in. And so they were able to practice and do it in a rapid fashion. And that's what I would recommend to employers as well. Look at your employees and say, you may be a book learning person, your managers may be, but are your employees? How is the best way to do it? And one of the ways that I have found, regardless of background, is kinesthetic, touch by doing. Everything else is how they're going to learn best. Touch the equipment, pull it out, take the disaster plan, pull it out, and actually go through what you're going to really do in an emergency.
So how frequently should you do that? I mean, you've got turnover in your plant probably or your business. How frequently should you do these? These drills are extensive. This training is extensive. Is there something you should do in the meantime and then have something on an annual basis? What is your recommendation?
Do your large exercise annually. So do them once a year. But you know what I also tell folks is I say, listen, every once in a while, if you have a group of people and you have some extra time or you have a particular day or you're preparing for a particular season, you're preparing for hurricane season or tornado season or wildfire season, take a group of employees. You don't have to take an hours long drill. Just do 20 minutes. Just grab them and say, okay, guys, what we're going to do real quick is we're going to grab the emergency equipment, grab the disaster plan. We're going to get together and we're going to just start the first 3 steps of the disaster plan. That's it. And you know what? That is so incredibly valuable that if you were able to do that just a few times a year, again, you don't have to commit the whole day, just 10, 15, 20 minutes. And if you get people to do it that quickly, you will find that people are so much more effective because they now know where everything is and how to activate it quickly.
Something that feed companies can work into their regular safety training programs, sounds like. So we've talked about a lot of things here today, and probably some folks are wondering, perhaps my business is too small to worry about some of this, or maybe it's too large. Is there an optimal size for the approach you're talking about? Does it work with any size business? What do you find?
Whether you have only one employee, which is yourself, or you have 10,000 or you have 100,000, you should always have a disaster plan. And you should always scale it down. One of the things I did when I first started my business was I actually, my company is now the largest small business disaster management company in the United States. We work with the average size of the businesses we work with are 10 employees. but I also have companies that have 200 employees. I also have companies that have 1,000 employees. I actually also work with businesses that have 10,000 employees, which are not technically small businesses, but when they're broken up into various offices, each one of those we treat as its own individual small business. And that's what you have to do as well. But no matter what, regardless of the size of the business, it's the culture of preparedness that matters. It's giving people that leadership responsibility, teaching them how to create a team through communication and getting things done and seeing it through that transcends any business size.
So, Patrick, what about situations where, say, a group would show up and wants to protest in front of your business or comes to push an agenda? How should employees respond? How should they be trained to deal with those encounters? I'm thinking it might be different than, say, a natural disaster.
It is. And the first thing that I would say, without question, and this really is one of the few instances where I say that this really especially has to be true, is there needs to be a written policy on it. So no matter what, there needs to be some kind of written policy of how to deal with protesters so that you are ensuring that you're not violating anyone's rights, but that they are not doing anything to interfere with your business. The way employees should be trained, however, is that they should be given some immediate steps of when they notice the protesters. So I'm going to think about that as like the instant a disaster strikes. So when they see the protesters, they need to pretend like an earthquake has just happened. What is the first things you have to do? And it's either pulling out a disaster plan or talking to management or both, and taking the first initial steps, because whatever it is, and it's hard for me to generalize today because there's so many different kinds of businesses involved. But when you're talking about protesters, it's something where you want to make sure that there are some basic standards followed. The one thing that I always do when I write these kinds of plans is I say to employees, it's not what you do, it's what you say that can make a big difference. So one of the things that I teach, particularly in industries where emotions can be very high, is I say, don't engage with protesters. You need to speak to management and have a solidified policy in place. But the one thing you do not want to do, the one thing that employees should know to do instantly, whether you are a large company, a small company, a medium-sized company, is do not engage with protesters, because you do not want to escalate the situation, because you don't know who these folks are. You don't know what's involved. Escalation, when I deal with what we call civil unrest, and that's really what this is. Even if they're peaceful protesters, you don't want it to escalate because you ultimately don't know who they are. But the de-escalation is what I find prevents the disaster from going from a small issue to becoming something that potentially involves an act of violence.
Like you say, it's what you say, but it's also how you say it, I'm assuming, right? If you get in their face and become confrontational, that has a whole different, it conveys a whole different message about your business. So, Patrick, great stuff. Any final words of advice here for our audience as we wrap up?
Absolutely. One last thing I want to say, which is this. There is really no such thing as a disaster. Really, there isn't. Only way that disasters occur is when you let them happen. And the reason why disasters happen is because people are not adequately prepared, because they don't give people the tools to be successful. So regardless, whether for you, that's a disaster plan, it's training, it's equipment, it's drills, it's all those things, no matter what it is, if you establish a culture of preparedness, if you put yourself in a position where you are truly resilient, then no matter what you are facing, whether it's a tornado, whether it's an act of terrorism, or whether it's a plane crash, you will never truly experience any disaster for the life of your business. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us here today. If you're interested in learning more, you can look at our September issue, and Patrick has an article in there, our digital edition, which came out this week. You also can watch for Patrick's book, which we put a link there in the comments. That comes out in March, I believe. As for what's ahead, we'll be at the University of Minnesota Layman Swine Conference here next week, so we hope to see you there. And of course, watch for our reports from St. Paul. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.